It was a typical autumn Friday when I, along with 4 friends, decided to explore the old, dense woods behind our town. Legend had it that these woods were cursed, haunted by the spirits of settlers who vanished without a trace centuries ago. Despite the warnings, our curiosity got the best of us, drawing us deeper into the forest's embrace. As we ventured further, the path became less clear, consumed by overgrowth and the untamed wilds. The air grew colder, a chill that seemed unnatural even for a late October evening. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches clawing at the fading light. "We should head back," said Jess, her voice a whisper against the howling wind. But we were too far gone, too enthralled by the thrill of the unknown. We pushed on until we found an old, crumbling cabin obscured by decades of neglect. The door creaked open with ease, surprising us. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of mold and decay. "Looks like no one's been here for ages," I remarked, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The others murmured in agreement, their lights darting from one shadow to another. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the cabin, making us jump. The door had slammed shut by itself, or so it seemed. "This isn't funny anymore," said Mark, his usual bravado faltering. We tried the door, but it wouldn't budge, as if sealed by an unseen force. That's when the whispers started, soft and indistinct, like the rustling of leaves. "Can you hear that?" asked Sarah, her eyes wide with fear. We all nodded, listening intently. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, forming words we couldn't understand. Then, without warning, a figure appeared in the corner of the room, barely visible. It was a man, or what used to be a man, his features twisted in anguish. "Leave now," he rasped, his voice a chilling blend of warning and plea. We backed away, too terrified to speak. But the exits remained sealed, trapping us inside with the apparition. It faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving us in suffocating darkness. We huddled together, our breaths heavy with dread. The night pressed on, each minute stretching into eternity. Shadows danced across the walls, shaped by the dim moonlight that filtered through the cracks. Every sound was magnified, every whisper of the wind a potential threat. Out of nowhere, a loud, shrill scream tore through the silence, coming from the woods outside. It was a human scream, full of pain and terror. "We have to help them," I said, my own voice sounding foreign in my ears. But the others were too scared, too overwhelmed by the fear of what might be lurking beyond the walls. As dawn approached, the door finally opened, as mysteriously as it had sealed. We rushed out, not stopping to look back. The woods seemed different in the light of day, less menacing, but the horror of the night lingered. We never spoke of that night again, each of us carrying the burden of our shared terror. The woods still stand, untouched and unexplored since our visit. Sometimes, when the wind is just right, I can still hear the whispers, calling me back to the darkness of the old cabin. But I know better than to return, for some horrors are best left buried in the shadows. The end of our story, perhaps, but the beginning of another for whoever dares to walk the same cursed path. Months had passed since that haunting night in the cabin, but the memories lingered like a persistent shadow. I often found myself waking in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the echoes of those ghostly whispers ringing in my ears. The peace I once knew had been shattered, replaced by a nagging sense of unease that clung to me like a second skin. One evening, while trying to distract myself with work, I received a call from Jess. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "It's back. The thing from the cabin. I saw it in my house." Her words sent a chill down my spine, rekindling the fear that I had tried so desperately to forget. "I'm coming over," I said, grabbing my keys. The drive to her house was tense, each shadow and movement catching my eye. When I arrived, Jess was pacing in the driveway, her face pale and drawn. "It was right here," she gestured wildly to the living room window. Standing there, staring inside. We cautiously entered the house, the air thick with the weight of our shared dread. The living room was cold, far colder than it should have been for a summer's night. "Do you feel that?" Jess asked, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, the chill settling in my bones. As we stood there, a faint noise caught our attention. It was a scraping sound, like something dragging across the floor. We followed the sound to the kitchen where the tiles were unnaturally cold under our feet. Suddenly, the room plunged into darkness as the lights flickered and died. In the pitch black, we heard it, a guttural moan that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Then, a voice, clearer than any whisper we had heard in the woods, "Leave, you do not belong." It was the same raspy, haunting tone from the cabin. We scrambled for the door, tripping over each other in our haste to escape. Outside, the night air felt like a reprieve, but the safety was an illusion. As we caught our breath, the ground beneath us began to tremble, and a thick fog rolled in from nowhere. Shapes moved within the fog, forms that were too distorted to be human, yet too intentional to be mere tricks of the light. "Where are they coming from?" Jess cried out, her eyes wide with terror. I had no answers, only the sinking realization that whatever we had disturbed at the cabin was far from finished with us. We ran to the car, the fog swirling aggressively as if trying to hold us back. Driving away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The fog was dissipating, but the image of a dark, twisted figure standing at the edge of the woods burned itself into my mind. It was taller than any man, with limbs that twisted unnaturally and eyes that glowed with a malevolent light. Over the next few days, each of us experienced visitations. Mark was the next to call. He had been at work when he felt a cold hand grip his shoulder. Turning around, he found nothing, but the sensation lingered, cold and clammy. Sarah experienced whispers that called out her name, voices that no one else could hear. We met often, seeking comfort in numbers, discussing what to do. It was during one of these meetings that I suggested we go back to the cabin. It started there, I reasoned. Maybe we can find something, some way to end this. The decision was met with mixed feelings, but the desperation in our eyes mirrored each other's. Armed with more resolve than sense, we returned to the woods. The path to the cabin was as unwelcoming as ever, the trees seeming to lean closer than before. The air was thick with the scent of rot, and the silence was oppressive. As we approached the cabin, the door swung open on its own, inviting us in with a sinister squeal. Inside, the cabin was exactly as we left it, untouched by time or elements. We spread out, searching for anything that could help us understand. In the back room, under a loose floorboard, I found a box. It was old, dust-covered, and filled with what appeared to be personal belongings, a locket, some letters, a diary. The diary belonged to a woman named Abigail, who lived in the woods in the late 1700s. Her entries started innocently enough, detailing life on the frontier. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone changed. Descriptions of strange figures watching from the woods, eerie lights, and her growing fear filled the pages. The last entry was chilling. "They are coming for me. I cannot escape them. I pray whoever finds this warns others to stay away from these cursed woods." As I read her words aloud, the temperature in the room dropped, and a sense of despair washed over us. We knew we were not alone. Shadows flickered at the edges of our vision, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. The whispers started again, louder this time, a cacophony of voices that drowned out all thought. "We need to leave," I shouted, but even as I spoke, the door slammed shut, trapping us inside. The whispers turned into wails, and from the shadows, figures emerged. They were ghastly, spectral forms that resembled the settlers in Abigail's diary, their eyes hollow with suffering. As they approached, the air grew suffocating, heavy with their despair. We were in their world now, subject to their torment. And as they closed in, the room filled with a blinding light. The light was so intense, it felt as if the sun itself had descended into the confines of the old cabin. Our eyes shut tight against the glare, and through the veil of my eyelids, I could see the red of the light. The spectral figures halted their advance, their forms becoming less defined, blurring into the brightness that filled the room. When the light finally dimmed, we cautiously opened our eyes. The cabin was empty, no sign of the ghostly settlers or the oppressive darkness that had accompanied them. "What just happened?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaky. None of us had an answer, only shared looks of confusion and fear. Outside, the woods seemed to have calmed. The wind had died down to a gentle breeze, and the unnatural chill was gone. Yet, the sense of dread lingered, a silent acknowledgement that whatever respite we felt was temporary. "We need to find out what's protecting this place," Mark said, his determination returning. "Or what's trapping those spirits here." We agreed, knowing that understanding might be our only chance to break the cycle of hauntings. The following days were spent researching the history of the area, poring over old maps and archives. We learned of a colony that vanished, wiped out under mysterious circumstances, their fates undocumented. The land where the cabin stood was once their settlement, lost to time and reclaimed by the forest. Armed with this knowledge, we returned to the cabin. This time, we brought equipment, cameras, voice recorders, anything that might capture proof or communicate with the spirits. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the ground, we set up our gear, preparing for the night. The cabin felt different by night, more alive, or perhaps more accurately, more haunted. The air was thick, charged with anticipation. We didn't have to wait long before the temperature dropped, a now familiar sign of the apparition's approach. A voice broke the silence, clear and resonant. "Why do you return?" It echoed around us, sourceless and omnipresent. "We want to help you," I called out into the darkness, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "We know what happened here." A figure materialized in the center of the room, more solid than any we had seen before. It was a woman, her face etched with sorrow. "Help us," she pleaded, her voice echoing the despair we had felt from the diary. "We are bound to this land, our souls tethered by an unspoken crime." "What can we do?" Jess asked, stepping closer. The figure's gaze was mournful as she pointed towards the floorboards under which we had found the diary and the box. "Free us," she whispered before fading away, leaving us with more questions than answers. We pried up the floorboards, digging through the dirt beneath. There, buried deep, was a collection of objects, bones, small trinkets, and what appeared to be ritualistic symbols, all entwined with strands of silver hair. "This must be it," Sarah said, her hands trembling as she held up a silver locket tarnished with age. That night, we performed a makeshift ceremony, hoping to release the spirits from their earthly bonds. We placed the items we had found in a circle, reciting words of release and peace, words we hoped would be enough. As we spoke the final words, the wind picked up, howling through the trees around us, whipping the leaves into a frenzied dance. One by one, the items began to sink into the ground, as if the earth itself was reclaiming them. A soft light enveloped the area, growing brighter with each passing second. Then, the light exploded in a dazzling burst, and the air was filled with the sound of voices, dozens of them whispering, "Thank you." The temperature returned to normal, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, and for a moment, the woods were peaceful. But our relief was short-lived. As we gathered our things, ready to leave the now quiet cabin, a cold dread settled over us. The calm was too sudden, too complete. We glanced at each other, the same thought unspoken between us. Had we truly freed the spirits, or had we simply appeased them for now? As we left the woods, a dense fog rolled in, obscuring our path and slowing our pace. We heard it then, a low, mournful wail that echoed through the trees. It was different from any sound we had heard before, a sound that seemed both a warning and a lament. "We need to keep looking," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "There's more to this, I can feel it." The others nodded, their faces set with resolve. We knew our journey was far from over. The woods held more secrets, darker and deeper than we had ever imagined. We made our way back to the car, the fog thickening around us, the wail growing fainter until it was just a whisper on the wind. But it was there, a reminder that the story of the deep woods was not yet finished, and neither were we. As we drove away from the woods, the fog that enveloped our path seemed to dissipate as mysteriously as it had appeared, allowing the moonlight to guide us back to the familiarity of our town. Yet, the silence between us spoke volumes. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts, replaying the events that had unfolded. The night's eerie calm was a stark contrast to the chaos we had experienced in the heart of the forest. Back at home, the comfort of my own bed did little to ease the unrest that churned within me. The whispers of the wind seemed to carry voices, the shadows cast by the moonlight danced with menacing intent. Sleep was elusive, as every small sound jolted me awake, drenched in sweat and filled with a dread too palpable to dismiss as mere nightmares. In the following days, we convened at Sarah's house, determined to piece together the history of the woods and the spirits we had encountered. Hours were spent combing through online archives, local library records, and interviewing longtime residents who spoke of the woods with a mixture of reverence and fear. Each piece of history added layers to our understanding, but also deepened the mystery. It was as if the land itself had a heart, one that beat in a rhythm of sorrow and darkness. Our research led us to an old historian, Mr. Whitaker, who lived on the outskirts of the town. His family had resided in the area for generations, and his knowledge about the local lore was unmatched. "You're meddling with things best left alone," he warned, his eyes clouded with concern. But as we shared our experiences, his demeanor shifted from wary to resolute. "It seems you've already stirred the pot. Might as well help you understand what's brewing," he conceded. Mr. Whitaker recounted tales passed down through his family, stories of a great tragedy that befell the early settlers, a community that had fallen victim to a plague that left no survivors. "The land where your cabin stands was once a thriving settlement, but everyone died within a fortnight. The place was cursed, marked by death. Those who tried to live there afterward never lasted long, plagued by sickness or driven mad by grief," he explained. Determined to end the cycle of horror, we planned one final trip to the woods. Armed with every piece of historical and spiritual protection advice Mr. Whitaker could give us, we felt as ready as we could ever be. The historian provided us with an old ritual, one that his ancestors believed could cleanse the land of its sorrowful past. "It's a binding ritual meant to seal away the darkness and allow the souls to find peace," he instructed carefully. As we entered the woods, the atmosphere was markedly different. The air was heavier, as if aware of our intentions. We reached the cabin at dusk, where the shadows seemed to stretch out towards us, as though trying to dissuade us from our path. Undeterred, we set up the ritual circle with salt and sage, placing the old relics Mr. Whitaker had provided at cardinal points. Under the rising moon, we began the incantations. The words felt powerful as they left our lips, vibrating through the air with an energy that seemed to pulse through the ground beneath our feet. The wind picked up, howling around us as if in protest, and the temperature dropped, biting into our skin despite our layered clothing. Midway through the ritual, a profound silence enveloped the area. The wind ceased, and the air grew oppressively still. Then, the ground began to tremble, leaves rustling as if in fear, and from the soil around the cabin, ethereal figures began to rise. They were translucent, shimmering under the moonlight, their faces etched with unspeakable sadness. "We release you from this curse," we chanted, our voices steady despite the awe and fear that gripped us. The figures began to approach the circle, their movements slow, hesitant. As they reached the edge, they paused, and one by one, they stepped into the light of our circle, their forms dissolving into motes of light that soared upwards, disappearing into the night sky. The last to approach was the woman we had seen before, her expression one of profound gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice like a breeze that kissed our cheeks before she too dissolved into light, her form scattering to join the others in their ascent to the heavens. As the last of the light faded, the heavy air lifted, replaced by a sense of peace that blanketed the woods. The land felt different. It was as if a weight had been lifted, a breath exhaled after centuries of sorrow. We left the woods in silence, each of us feeling the weight of what we had experienced. The sun rose as we exited the forest, casting golden light through the trees, illuminating the path forward. The curse was broken, the spirits freed, and though we knew the woods would always hold a hint of their mysterious past, the horror was gone. We never returned to the cabin, nor did we need to. The hauntings ceased, the nightmares faded, and life returned to a semblance of normalcy. But the memory of those nights, the things we saw, and the voices we heard lingered. They became a part of our story, a shared experience that bonded us forever. And as I write this final recounting of our encounters, I look out my window towards the woods, now serene and bathed in the light of a peaceful dawn. The darkness has lifted, the curse ended, and while the history of those woods is rich and deep, the horror is no more. We had ventured into the unknown, faced the ghosts of the past, and emerged into the light, forever changed, but ultimately unbroken.